No, put it back up. Title slide, back up. We're like 3.5 years in, a bit more than that now. I thought I would just talk about myself for a while, for the next 6 weeks. How great I am, how this church wouldn't exist without me. And I just thought that would be a really great opportunity to do that. Obviously, that's a joke. We are going to be looking at the story of Joseph for the next 6 weeks. Today's kind of an intro, but if you've got your Bible on you, you could turn to Genesis chapter 37. I'm not going to read everything out. You can read through as we're going along if you want, especially to make sure that what I'm saying is right and I'm not just chatting a load of rubbish. So you can turn to Genesis chapter 37. The whole of chapter 37 is where we're going to be basing ourselves this morning. And obviously we're going to look at the key events in the life of Joseph, who was the son of Jacob and grandson of, great-grandson, I think, of Abraham. So, Genesis chapter 37. And today's title for this is Living the Dream When Life is a Nightmare. Very catchy title. I didn't make it up. Someone else did. So we're going to be looking at Joseph over the next 6 weeks. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. We're not going to be looking at every single chapter of Genesis from the start of the story of Joseph in chapter 37 all the way up to chapter 50, I think it is. We're going to look at the main events and what they tell us about God and us. And so obviously today we're basing ourselves in chapter 37, which takes us from Joseph being, many of us, all of us really, probably know the story. It's a story that's told in Sunday school. You get very familiar with the story. And I think just like we're finding out in Bible study with the story of Jonah, what we're often taught in Sunday school doesn't do the story anywhere near justice. So hopefully we're going to dig a little deeper this morning and find some amazing things that God is saying to us through the story of Joseph. So Joseph is the grandson or great-grandson of Abraham. And remember, earlier in Genesis, God had given Abraham the promise that he'd have so many descendants that he wouldn't be able to count them all if he tried, and that all the earth would be blessed because of him. And so this is a story that would have been passed down through the generations in Joseph's family, and no doubt, in a way, I think that his family would have felt that special connection to God in terms of God has given us an incredible promise for this family, and we're part of that. So Joseph's part of that promise. Actually, the family of Joseph will become the 12 tribes of Israel. But we already hit a problem in this story because it tells us that Jacob loved Joseph more than his other sons. If you want to just put the verse up for me, please, Noah. That would be amazing. I think it's just the next slide. It wasn't that, but it's fine. That's the one. Thank you. So it says, now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his brothers because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. So, Joseph is Jacob's favorite child. And as if that wasn't bad enough for the brothers, Joseph doesn't exactly exhibit a humble life or attitude, demeanour. It's obvious to the brothers that Joseph is the favourite, and then it just gets worse when Jacob decides to give Joseph a gift that is far above and beyond what any of the others have received. I don't know, for those of us parents in the room, that's one thing that when it comes to like birthdays and Christmas, I'm always thinking like, I want to treat my kids, even though my kids have different interests and all that kind of stuff, I want to treat them the same. I want them to know that I love them equally. And of course, that's more than just gifts, but I think that does come down to that planning too. But Jacob makes it so obvious that he just loves Joseph more than the rest of them by making him this, what the Bible calls an ornate robe, something of many colours, which in those days would have been really difficult to come by. I know that we can just walk into any shop or go online and we can buy clothes with all sorts of colours and patterns and all that kind of stuff on it, but in those days that wouldn't have been a common thing. And so to have been made a robe like that would have been really, really special. And then it gets even worse because Joseph, despite the fact that it's obvious that his dad loves him more than the rest of them, his dad's given him this gift that no one else in his family will receive a gift like that. Joseph decides, I can see them all messing around in the fields with the sheep and not really doing the job that they're supposed to do. I tell you what I'll do. I'll go to dad and I'll go tell dad that they're all being idiots and that they're not doing what they're supposed to. So it's not exactly going down a great path here already. And then Joseph decides to make things even worse because it tells us in the Bible that God gives Joseph a couple of dreams. And so Joseph, he receives these dreams, he takes them in, and instead of being like Mary in the New Testament, who treasures what God says to her in her heart, Joseph says, what I need to do is share my dreams, these dreams that put me above everybody else in my family, which would have been crazy in those times, because in those times there was a real emphasis on the firstborn being the one who had the birthright and was the heir and the successor to everything that the father had and stuff like that. So the idea that number 13, something like that, would rule over the rest of the family would have been... Pardon? You've heckled me now. I'm terrible with maths.
There's 12 brothers, how can he be number 13?
Number 12.
No, wrong again.
Wrong!
11. 11.
Just let the guy preach.
My maths is really bad. This needs cutting out, please, Stu. My maths is really bad.
Who's number 13?
So it's number 11. Thank you, Jess. Number 11. Thank you for making it obvious to everybody else in this room. Thank you. That's exactly what I needed right now. I'm really glad that you were there to humble me. Anyway, yeah, that's true. I can't even remember what I was going to say now. Where am I up to here? Joseph. So Joseph goes to his dad and he gives this bad report, and that just makes his brothers hate him even more. And so, as we know in the story, his brothers, their jealousy, their hatred of Joseph grows. And what they decide to do is, what most of them decide that they want to do is kill him. They want him gone. They've had enough. They've had enough of watching their father sort of love on him greater than he loved on anyone else in the family. They had enough of watching his father give gifts that none of the rest of them would receive anything like that. They've had enough of this spoiled little brat. who decides that he is better, well, to them anyway, looks like he's better than everyone else. He's just getting everything. His life is going amazing. He's not having to work for it. He's not the one having to go out in the fields and work with the sheep or the cattle or whatever it is that they had. He just gets to mess around, stay at home, turn up, and then go and tell Dad that they're not doing the job that they're supposed to be doing. And to top it all off, he's saying to them, God's told me that one day I'm going to rule over all of you. And so he decides, so some of his brothers actually decide, you know what, we want rid of him, and we're going to kill him. But the first thing that this tells us, as Joseph has these dreams from God, is that God has a plan for every single one of us. We can choose whether we live life the way that God intends or the way that we intend. That's been the battle throughout history, from the first humans that lived right until now and beyond. Choosing to live the life that God intends or what we intend. And God reveals his plans to us in different ways, doesn't he? Through scripture, through prayer, through dreams, through other people, through circumstances, among other things. And God revealed his plan to Joseph through these dreams. Now, like I said before, Joseph's dreams seemed ridiculous because though we can tell... I've put something wrong here. Yeah, so though the brothers could tell that that Jacob loved Joseph more than the rest, the idea that the second youngest in the family would rule all over the rest of the family was just not a thing, not in that culture. And yet God has this incredible way of doing the incredible and the impossible through the unlikeliest people in the unlikeliest of places at the unlikeliest of times. And the story of Joseph is no exception. And it's true for our lives too. So the way I look at this is that there is hope for us here at Restoration Church, because as a small church, I would say that in that sense that we are an unlikely people in a very unlikely place. The joke I always make with people when they ask me why we planted the church in Droylsden is that it would not have made it on my top 1,000 places to have planted a church. And yet God, we have those moments, don't we, where we have this idea, we have this plan, and yet God. And what that means is that God can do, that God will do the incredible through us. And so I pray that regardless of whether we are known by many or by few, that we are simply obedient to God in the place that he has called us. I pray that we live in the confidence that God has a plan for every single one of us. And so I want to ask you this first question. You all right to put the first question up for me, Noah? What is God's plan for your life? So these are all together, so it's kind of all blends into one question. What is your plan for your life? Are they the same? How can you or do you find out? If you sat next to your spouse, move. Not that I'm picking anyone specifically. Go. You've got 2 minutes.
Good talk.
So, what we see at the beginning of this story in chapter 37 is that God has a plan, and God reveals his plan to Joseph. Joseph doesn't exactly go about sharing those plans in the best way, but because of his brothers' hatred of him, because some of them want him dead, when Joseph comes out to meet them in the field, they take their opportunity, let's say. And the next point that I want to make is that life doesn't always go to plan, and that's what we see in the life of Joseph, and I don't know if anyone else can resonate with that. but I think that we all can. Joseph's life quickly turns from dreamland into nightmare as his brothers plot to kill him, but ultimately they decide to sell him off to merchant traders who would sell him on as a slave. And so I just want to ask a question, how about you? It's a rhetorical question, how about you? Have you ever been in a situation where you're carrying a dream or a passion and then it suddenly starts turning on its head and suddenly you can't see how things are going to turn around? Life certainly does not always go to plan. You know, even if you are the kind of person who meticulously goes after certain goals and challenges and circumstances in your life, there are always unforeseen twists, turns, bumps, and sometimes even full stops. And I think there's two sort of sub-stories that we can learn from here as Joseph's brothers decide to do something that ultimately is going to hurt their father because of their intense hatred of Joseph. There's two sub-stories that I think we can learn from. The first is this: Jacob's favoritism of Joseph bred a hatred in his brothers. Now let me just say this, Joseph's brothers still had full responsibility for their thoughts and actions, but it does provide context for why this story goes the way it does. You know, Jacob's favoritism of Joseph could have stemmed from his own life when his father favored his twin brother instead of him. And I think there's this thing in life where, because of the painful experiences that we go through in life, we can think to ourselves, I don't want others, or I don't want people in my family to experience what I have been through. But what we can sometimes do is we can overcorrect. You know, in the case of Jacob, he was not the favorite in his family. He was not the one who was going to get the birthright and the blessing and all that kind of stuff. And so he might have gone through life thinking, I'm not going to raise my family that way. The youngest ones in my family are not going to be the ones who are overlooked. But in an ironic way, it's an overcorrection, and actually it breeds a hatred in Joseph's brothers as Jacob tries to overcorrect the hurt that had been done to him in the past. And we've got to be careful not to allow the pain of our past to be something that hurts others, because otherwise we create a cycle. Now, if we take that story onwards, and again, this is ifs and shoulda, coulda, woulda kind of territory. We don't know what would have happened had Joseph's brothers not decided to throw him in a well, sell him on into slavery, and pretend that he was dead. But ultimately, his brothers hated the fact that he was the favourite, and so they might have grown up in their lives thinking, I'm not going to raise my family like that. That's really hurt me, and so I'm going to make sure that my family isn't. And you just get into this cycle. It becomes a cycle of destruction. And so we've got to deal with our pain in appropriate ways to allow it to form us, as James would say. Who remembers the start of the year when we decided to do James? And it said, consider it pure joy when you go through trials of many kinds. Why? Because it's going to make you more like Jesus. And so we must deal with our pain in the appropriate way to allow it to form us into the likeness of Jesus, who embodied the fruits of the Spirit that we find in Galatians. The second sub-story is one of Joseph's pride, and we've already mentioned this a little bit, but they say that pride comes before a fall, and in Joseph's case, that is exactly what metaphorically and physically happens. You know, it's one thing to carry the promises of God, but it's another thing to act like you own them. You know, God often uses those who are least expected to do the most incredible. You know, throughout the story of the Bible, God uses people who nobody else expects. A shepherd boy becomes a king. God himself steps into human history. God uses someone who is persecuting the church in order to build the church. It's crazy, but over and over and over again, God uses the most unlikely people in the most unlikely places, in the most unlikely of ways to build his kingdom. And I love this verse in, a few verses in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 25 to 27. It says this: "For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards." Thanks for that, Paul. That's really kind of you to say that about me. "Not many of you were influential. Not many of you were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. And God chose the weak things of this world to shame the strong." And I can't think of a time in my life when God has said to me, "I really need you because you're the best for this situation that I've got going on. There's no one else in this world who can deal with this situation that's going on better than you. I need you." I cannot think of a situation in my life where God has needed me. But that's the beautiful thing about the gospel, is God uses me despite my weaknesses. And we are to favour humility over self-promotion. And I think the reason that we love the Joseph story is because we see God's redemptive story at the end. We see how God redeems his life, his situation at the end, as he eventually becomes second in charge over all of Egypt. He saves his family's life, and ultimately he saves the nation of Israel from the famine that was happening. And we love that, because it's like, oh, Joseph went through all these really difficult things, but look how God turned it around in the end. And we love that. But the problem is, in our own lives, it's hard to see God's redemptive story happening when we're in the middle of the nightmare. Because in our own lives, we can find ourselves, metaphorically speaking, in the well, in slavery, or in jail. And it's hard to see how things are going to turn around. It's hard to see how God is going to use the experiences that we are going through to bring about his kingdom and his purpose, and to redeem our lives and to make us whole in him. And so it's really hard to trust that God has a redemptive story in the making when we're in the middle of the nightmare. You know, when Joseph shared his dreams with his brothers, I can guarantee he did not think, but you know what I'm going to have to go through to get there is being chucked in a well, almost killed by them, sold into slavery, accused of something that I didn't do, spend time in jail, eventually to get out and help everything. And everything's not for a second would he have thought any of that would happen. And yet it did. And I wonder where we find ourselves today, because Joseph had to hold on to the dreams that God had given him when he was in those moments, when it looked like things couldn't get any worse. But here is the good news: God is faithful. Living the dream is not about living a comfortable and enjoyable life, but it's about living a life that rests in the confidence and power that God is faithful. Jesus did not say the kingdom of heaven is when you die. We can experience it here and now. Jesus tells us in Luke 17, verse 2, that the kingdom of heaven is in our midst. Throughout the book of Mark, Jesus tells us that the kingdom of heaven has come near. The kingdom of heaven is here, and yet it is still to come. In theological terms, we call it the now and the not yet. God's faithfulness too is present and yet to come. There is a faithfulness of God that we can experience now in the middle of everything that is going on. But there is a faithfulness that will come at the end when God makes everything right. When we see him face to face and we are made whole in him. And the most extraordinary thing about the life of Joseph is the confidence that he has in God's faithfulness. And we'll come on to that in future weeks. But I want to end with this. The Joseph story is a picture of Jesus. Now, there's an overarching picture that I'm going to leave to later weeks. But even here in Genesis chapter 37, we see that when the brothers decide to sell Joseph and Judah comes and is absolutely distraught because ultimately he was thinking there's got to be a way that we can get out of this, that we can just go back and we can make everything right. And then when his brothers sell him, that's obviously not going to happen because there's no way they could have known where he was going to go. And Joseph says, Judah says, the way that we're going to deal with this is we're going to take this robe and we're going to cover it in the blood of one of the goats. And then we're going to take it to our father and use that as a sign that he has been killed and that it's got nothing to do with us. And even that image is powerful because we see that when the brothers sell him, they take his robe. The robe is a symbol to them of hatred, of hurt, of sin. And they cover it in the blood of an innocent goat. Ultimately, the wrong that had been done had been them. You know, later in the Old Testament, the Israelites would do something similar to receive the forgiveness of God. Once a year on the Day of Atonement, a priest would take a lamb or a goat and sacrifice it, and taking its blood and sprinkling it on the people and their clothes. And this would be a sign of atonement between the people and God. And fast forward to the New Testament, we see that Jesus is the Lamb of God who was sacrificed for all, and his body and his blood broken and shed for us. His death brought forgiveness between us and God, and his resurrection defeated death and sin, and now we get to live a new life because of that. In Romans 13, Paul tells us to clothe ourselves not in an ornate robe, but to clothe ourselves with the Lord Jesus. Because of Jesus, we get to take on a new nature and a new life. And we get to live in the hope of Jesus, even when life seems like a nightmare. And now, if someone wouldn't mind going and grabbing the kids, we're going to remember God's faithfulness and forgiveness and love and our hope as we take communion. But while the kids are coming in, why don't you turn to the person next to you and answer this question? What is an example of God's faithfulness in your life? Why don't you just take a couple of minutes just to do that while the kids come in? What examples do you have of God's faithfulness in your life?